Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer in Tel Aviv. The opening bell of the fateful next Israeli election, set to happen in the fall, has officially been rung. A pair of former Israeli prime ministers, Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid, surprised and rocked the political landscape here when they took to the stage and announced that they were merging their parties together for the next election into a coalition called Together, Yachad in Hebrew. Their move is being seen as a recognition that the only way to unseat Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is through a united front, and the sooner his opposition unites, the better. When the two men joined forces in 2021 and formed a coalition against Netanyahu, they succeeded in defeating him, although their government only held together for a year. But presumably they figure if they did it once, they can do it again. And surely when Netanyahu is a far weaker rival following October 7th and the past 3 years of nearly constant war. Joining me to discuss whether that assumption is true and what it means for the election and Israel's future is Haaretz columnist and veteran political analyst and strategist, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin. Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, welcome to the podcast again.
Thank you for having me again.
Dahlia, how surprised were you when at this early stage, because the campaign isn't even official, the elections haven't even been officially set and announced, former Prime Ministers Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid take to the stage to announce they are running together, literally together, that's the name of their party, with Lapid backing Bennett as the candidate as prime minister, this time clearly taking a backseat to Bennett as opposed to their partnership the last time around where they sat together, took turns. Were you surprised?
I was not entirely surprised that there was some merger, because in every Israeli election campaign, I expect to see parties merge, collapse, form ex nihilo, or break up if they were together before. So all of those kinds of changes are essentially a standard feature of Israeli election cycles. And certainly in the opposition group, I expected that to happen at some point. Did I exactly expect it to be Bennett and Lapid? Yes and no. The yes is there's an obvious reason why it was not entirely a surprise, and that's that they've had a very good, how shall I put this, long-term relationship. They have been in coalition together going back to 2013 when they both went into a government led by Benjamin Netanyahu. At that time, they even boasted of having what they called something like an alliance of the brothers. In other words, they have a political bromance on some level. It's obviously something to do with their personal chemistry. So I think personal chemistry counts for a lot in politics. And I would also say that, yes, the partnership by which they went into a coalition together in what we call the change government in 2021 was a decent harbinger of the possibility of them doing something together now. And back then, I would probably characterize it a little bit differently in the sense that also at that time, Yair Lapid took a back seat, allowing Naftali Bennett to become prime minister first. And it was probably not surprising, and it was fairly predictable that that would mean that Lapid was actually in the prime minister seat for a very short period of time, because that government didn't last very long. How much of this was known beforehand is not clear, but when you let somebody go first to be prime minister, it's always a huge risk that you'll never get to the rotation. We have these rotation deals. And so at the time, I think it was pretty clear that back then, Yair Lapid was also sacrificing the top job for political pragmatism in a sort of self-sacrificing way that is very rare in Israeli politics. So he's doing it yet again. And that may be a little bit surprising, although I should say fairly in character for Lapid. He has demonstrated that he has that capacity. The one way in which it is surprising is that strategically, when you look at the Israeli voters, when you look at the map of Israeli voters, and when you look at the people who should be Bennett's target voters, those who are not currently supporting him, but who he hopes to win over, obviously he wants to take people away from the bloc of voters supporting Netanyahu. And I will say that going in with Lapid is unlikely to really help that cause, because Lapid in this current Israeli environment is viewed as left-wing, frankly, by the kinds of voters that Bennett might have hoped he was taking away from the Netanyahu bloc. The other possibility is that he has given up on those voters, is that he said to himself, anybody who's still supporting one of Netanyahu's allies or Likud itself at this point probably can't be won over by Bennett. If maybe he's having this conversation with himself for various reasons we can discuss. And I should concentrate on consolidating and maximizing every possible vote within the bloc, which is, I suppose, the strategic conclusion they came to. They seem to also want to show that they are the politicians who can generate unity, generate momentum, generate excitement. I think they're hoping to continue with further mergers. They've called on Gadi Eisenkot to join them. He's leading his own party right now, and we'll see where it ends. But for those reasons, in general, it wasn't entirely surprising. And the only surprise maybe was at the strategic level of who they see as their target voters.
So to stay on strategy in the horse race for a minute before we get into the real guts of what Naftali Bennett prime ministership would look like and whether he is somebody that the camp should get behind. Initially, at least in the polling, we're seeing that Lapid and Bennett together merged are getting fewer seats than they did separately. And now we're having talk of, as you said, Lieberman and former IDF chief of staff Eisenkot, who's kind of the new kid on the block, relatively speaking, in terms of vying for prime ministership. So is joining together to make this centrist, united front merged party against Netanyahu a good idea for those whose top priority is to rid the country of Bibi? Strategically speaking, do you think it's going to be the right thing to do?
Well, they've already done it. And the question is whether further mergers will help. And, this is really, in some ways, either extremely sophisticated strategic, political strategy and mathematical calculations, or it's absolutely an arbitrary guess, finger in the wind. That's how I have to put it. I mean, we have various precedents we can go by. There is a long-running rule of thumb in Israeli politics that when two parties merge, usually when the elections come around, they don't do as well as they did separately in the outgoing Knesset. Or if they're new parties, they don't do as well as they were doing separately in surveys. And they get slightly fewer when they run combined. At the same time, there are some cases that have broken that rule. So which is it going to be? The rule of thumb or the exception that proves the original rule? All of these are possible. I mean, I hate to be wishy-washy about it, but it's too soon to know. I will say the following, that the constituency that these parties that you just mentioned, which are basically the anti-Netanyahu right wing, or what Israelis might view as center-right, they are all vying for a group of people who are a significant chunk of the Israeli population. They're somewhere between the right-leaning center, the moderate right, as Israelis perceive it, which is, by my calculations, we're talking over 30% of the Jewish population, that's a lot of voters. And we see that these parties really do add up, because if you think about Bennett and Lapid's party at this point getting about 25 seats on average, let's say, or a little bit lower, or a little bit more. Gadi Eisenkot getting somewhere between 10 and even 15 seats. And then Lieberman getting another, 7 or 8. I mean, it adds up to something like I just said. So I think the best way is not to have just one party, because then some of those people will fray and say, well, I don't feel myself represented by this particular party, and they'll go somewhere else. And at the same time, not too many small parties, because some of them will fall below the threshold, as Benny Gantz currently is, right? Benny Gantz, remember, was running at 40 seats, as high as 40 seats for his party alone in the 6 months, or at points he hit up to 40 seats in the phase after October 7th. Now, usually he was simply the biggest party, not quite that high. That's how rapidly fortunes can change. And currently his polls for months now have shown that Benny Gantz's party is well below the electoral threshold to make it into parliament. We're talking about fewer than 3.25% of the votes. Most surveys have him barely over 2%. And so if there are too many parties in that space, some people will vote for them. 2% is a lot of wasted votes. And so there must be a sweet spot. It could be 3 parties, right? It could be the new Biyachad party, Lieberman and Eisenkot, and maybe that would maximize the votes. And if Benny Gantz drops out and, or joins with one of the other ones, that's probably best. But maybe the sweet spot is 2 parties. Maybe either Lieberman or Eisenkot should drop out. And at that point, I think it's really, I can just imagine the campaign teams having bitter disagreements in their situation rooms, each advisor trying to best, outsmart the other, but nobody really would have an answer as to what that sweet spot really is, just that they're all fighting for a rather big piece of the pie, which is why we see these multiple parties to begin with.
Do you feel like Lapid's decision, the possible future decision of Yair Golan to join the group, as taking a page out of the Hungarian election results, that it's going to take a right-winger to bring down a populist authoritarian right-winger who is sabotaging democracy. You have to fight fire with a smaller fire. And basically the center left to the left is going to hold its nose and be behind a Bennett prime ministership, despite the fact that he's not ideologically aligned with them, to say the least, just because they feel like the continued prime ministership of Benjamin Netanyahu is such an existential danger to the country?
Well, there's no question that if the opposition parties win the elections, in other words, if all of the opposition parties, get 70 seats in Knesset, as many of the polls have shown, and I mean all the opposition parties, then all of the opposition parties, Zionist or Arab parties, will have to make decisions about whether they go into the coalition. And there's very little doubt in my mind that all of the Zionist parties will try to go into a coalition. So after the elections, of course, Yair Golan of the Democrats Party would join a coalition under a right-wing Naftali Bennett. I don't think there's any doubt about that, because they agree over the basic premise that there should be a different government. Now, you raised a possibility in conversation that is also something we might want to think about hypothetically, which is if Netanyahu is not in the scene. If Netanyahu somehow exits gracefully, and Likud is a party led by somebody else, it opens up, a whole new set of possibilities for coalition building, especially with Naftali Bennett really coming from the right. In fact, he started his political career for the first decade to the right of the Likud in numerous ways that we can talk about. So in terms of what's going to win elections, I think that it's, the comparison to Hungary is always interesting. I do think the commentary has been misleading to assume that Peter Magyar is, really deeply committed to liberal democratic principles and, all the things that a liberal's dream. I don't exactly see it yet. We have to wait and see. It wasn't, that wasn't quite his campaign. And he did, as you correctly portrayed, kind of emerge from the same party as Orban. And, in some ways that's a parallel to Bennett, who came from a different party, but was a protege of Netanyahu and comes from the right. And I think also it's really based on their reading of Israeli society. So Bennett both comes from the right genuinely. I don't think he's given up on, frankly, any of his right-wing principles, with one exception, that he has a less populist political style and more pragmatism in terms of who his partners might be. But the fundamental elements that make him right-wing, I think, are very genuine. And there's a perception that the Israeli public is extremely, hawkish, conservative, even, extremely right-wing, and can't tolerate anything less than Netanyahu's style policies and ideology, minus the populism and the corruption. I think that's how Israeli politicians perceive the Israeli Jewish public. And so they're going with that in addition to their existing ideology, particularly, again, on the anti-Netanyahu right. So that characterizes Bennett.
Right now, Bennett has announced that he will not bring, quote unquote, non-Zionist parties into his coalition. The polls show that so far, without any Arab parties in the coalition, we won't get a majority to overturn Netanyahu. So is this a doomed scenario, or can things always change?
Things can always change. There's no question. We're very far out from elections. And I would caution everybody, I'm going to repeat this in every interview and every article I do before the elections, and that's a long time. I will repeat that polls do not predict election results, certainly not at this stage. At best, they will be a pretty close indicator when we get much closer to the elections, and I'm talking in the few weeks before elections. The trajectories will show us something about what we can expect in the months before elections, but we're more than half a year away from elections right now. And so I think that there's still so much that can change, both in terms of the structure of the parties themselves, which parties are running, not running, who's on their lists, who are going to be prominent figures and candidates. We don't know any of that. And much of that will change how Israelis see this. There are developments on the ground we can't predict. So, of course, things can change. Having given that caveat, up until now, I can say very confidently that really none of the credible mainstream polling from January 2023 onward, so really over 3 years now, has shown one of two things. All of the polling has been very consistent that Netanyahu's coalition is not able to win a majority, and I'm talking about the credible polls that are not advocacy polls. We can talk about that separately. And that the Zionist parties, or the Jewish parties as Israelis see them, are not able to get 61 seats out of 120. In other words, they're not able to get a majority for a coalition, in most of the polls, in the vast majority of the polls. There was about a 3-week streak in the newspaper Ma'ariv's weekly polling just before this merger. When they did get 61, they have drifted back to 60 in that polling, but in other surveys, they're getting somewhere around 59, 60, but barely 61. And so up until now, that's really a 3-year trend. And so it's going to be hard to break through that. It's not impossible, just as it's not impossible that Netanyahu's coalition could add a slice of the voters and maybe even win a majority the way they did in 2022. So we have to understand that there's so much that can change. Polls can only go so far when neither the political system and party structure has been set, nor the voters' attitudes towards it. But what we see most consistently over the course of those 3 years, from January 2023 to the present, is what I mentioned before, that the current Netanyahu's alliance of parties has been unable to win a majority, and the Zionist parties are unable to win a majority without the support of Arab parties. Combined, all of the opposition parties, Jewish parties, Arab parties, etc., are getting in the upper 60 seats, even as high as 70 seats, very consistently, for 3 years. So it remains to be seen whether that will be broken. But I think a long, 3-year streak does signify something, that Netanyahu's current coalition has a ceiling of support. And the Iran war in June 2025 and the current Iran war definitely has not been able to break through that so far.
Meaning that after the election, whoever leads the opposition to Netanyahu may have to make the decision of it will stand or fall on their decision whether or not to allow these quote unquote non-Zionist parties, aka Arab parties, to join the coalition, that it could be Netanyahu or being open to this possibility.
Yeah, I mean, assuming, again, that Netanyahu stays in the race, because there's already some chatter in the Twitterati community about him not being the candidate. I have no idea how serious it is at this point. If it's Netanyahu leading Likud, it looks very likely that the opposition parties will both win a majority and be unable to win a majority or form a coalition without the Arab parties. And then they'll have to face their frankly foolish, promises locking themselves into banning those parties from their coalition. If they want to have any hope of forming a government, they will earn the wrath of some voters, the 1 or 2 who are still naive enough to believe pre-election coalition promises, because Israeli parties always break their coalition promises. It's like an open running joke and theme, or not a joke, but Israelis have seen this time and again for at least the last 20 years. So nobody should be surprised if that happens. And I suppose, the party leaders from the opposition are saying these things, again, because they are enslaving themselves to what they think is public opinion, being against that just because of a very crude sense that the Israeli public is hardline and right-wing, which it is. But I don't see evidence that the majority of Israelis, especially, let's say, those who support the opposition parties, are so dead set against it. We'll have to get some more polling on that. But they accepted it once. Many people think the change government was, the better path for Israel. And it can happen again. And I have a feeling that they're not going to completely reject that option if it should come to that.
Bennett is enjoying dodging the question of, would you maybe change your mind and allow the non-Zionist parties into the coalition if it means taking power and defeating Netanyahu? He says, no, I'm confident we're going to get a majority without them. That's his evasion.
Yeah. Bluster has become a political tactic and also a tactic of governance. Look how Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Donald Trump have portrayed the war in Iran. It's all bluster. Great victories, stunning victories, victories that have set them back for generations, victories everywhere, and yet the war is really not over. Somebody got the great idea that you can invent, grandiose statements to try to reshape people's view of reality, and then somehow reality will fall into line when it doesn't.
So, given all that, getting into the bones of the prospect of Naftali Bennett as Prime Minister of Israel, you wrote a column headlined "The Problem with Naftali Bennett." So, what is the problem with Naftali Bennett? Other than the obvious, memories seem to be short, the reason that he already has been prime minister and basically failed to keep a government together.
So I should be a little bit kinder, because the problem with Naftali Bennett is not really only Naftali Bennett's problem. I was arguing that it's a problem in the entire ideology of the Israeli right wing, going all the way back to Jabotinsky and everybody since. And even that is probably being unfair, because frankly, it's a problem that, the whole Zionist left shares as well. But I think that it's articulated best, and not just articulated best. I think the policies are more extreme. in the case of, historically what the Israeli right wing broadly and very generally, well beyond Likud, have stood for, because the idea that Israel should own the maximum possible amount of land. And, of course, that's predicated on somehow, there would always be a Jewish majority, which already, runs afoul of historical developments. Palestinians are not going away. Palestinians will not be banished. They can't be expelled. But the right wing would have it that Israel somehow, owns the greatest possible amount of territory, has a minority in Jabotinsky's view, going way back, just a minority of Palestinians, and therefore can be a completely liberal society. And I do credit Jabotinsky with the most developed thinking about what liberal principles really mean and what liberal democracy really means. And I'm not saying that cynically. I think he was a much deeper thinker about these things, but somehow that set the tone for Likud when it was formed in the early 70s to incorporate liberal values, and even a party called the Liberal Party. It was based on that, and establishing a kind of wing of the party that was really grounded in advancing what, relative to what Israel was in its earliest decades, a much more centralized state in its first decades led by Ben-Gurion, who was really not particularly liberal, and concentrated power and set up a system with very few constraints on the executive power and a lot of gray areas and no constitution, all those things. Under the right-wing Likud governments, the state went through a great amount of liberalization at various levels: economic liberalization, legislation, court rulings, advancing various things like gender equality, separation of religion and state, in very small increments, to be sure, but a very clear direction, culminating in the 1992 legislation of basic human rights in Israel's basic laws, which was led by a Likud government and under a right-wing dominated Knesset and supported by parties across the aisle. People forget that that was a right-wing project because they were committed to liberal values at the same time that these parties were advocating permanent control over Palestinians, expansion of Israeli territory, sovereignty, settlements in the West Bank, which has become much more explicit now. And that can never be liberal because it entails suppressing another people, robbing them of self-determination, ruling over them with an authoritarian military rule, which is fundamentally illiberal.
And Dahlia, you view Bennett as the heir to this outlook of you can have both a right-wing greater land of Israel and small L liberal values.
No, I don't see him as the heir to that because I don't see him, for most of his political career, I don't think he was committed to liberal values. His party advocated a platform of annexation. He brought annexation formally into Israeli political campaigning for the first time, in modern times, I should say. In 2012, when he published his annexation platform for parts of the West Bank, he brought religious fundamentalists into the Israeli political system, extremists by the name of, for example, Bezalel Smotrich, who wrote in as a constituent party of Bennett's then party, the Jewish Home. And he and his co-party leader at the time, Yair Lapid, took the lead. I mean, they spearheaded the assault on the Israeli judiciary. So I don't think he himself was ever deeply committed to liberal principles. But the problem that I was trying to point out was that through the merger with Yair Lapid's party, the two of them developed this idea that they're going to have a kind of liberal and right-wing political force in Israeli society. And Israelis think that sounds great because for some reason, again, which baffles me, even Israelis are, unable to see the contradiction. It's the same contradiction that meant you had masses of Israelis on the street protesting the assault on the judiciary in 2023, but refusing to talk about occupation. To my mind, they're inseparable. Occupation is fundamentally incommensurate with anything like liberal democracy. It both undermines liberal democracy, and liberal democracy cannot actually sustain itself because you need institutions that are designed to support an authoritarian military structure in order to be an occupying power. Israelis' failure to see this means that the contradiction is far more widespread than just the right wing.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a failure to see it or maybe just wishful thinking for those who would like the occupation to continue, or maybe, to put it more generously, are afraid of a two-state solution, are afraid of any kind of end to total Israeli control over the territories. It's their way of thinking that they can have their cake and eat it too.
I accept that, absolutely, as part of the reason.
Dahlia, you've been writing a lot of columns, not only about Naftali Bennett and in these horse race politics, but particularly lately about Israel and the issue of existential threats. Now, this is connected to the politics we've been discussing because it seems one of the ways that Netanyahu seems to hang on to power is by convincing us that we are constantly in mortal danger. Only he can protect us, sort of a vision since October 7th of a forever war that we must eternally fight or be destroyed. And you wrote, again, 2 columns. In the second one, you said that not only do you think that Israelis overestimate their existential threats from without, but point out that we do have an existential threat that comes from within.
Yes. Now, I want to make 2 points that I think are important to draw out within this pair of articles. In the first one, I tried to deal with external military threats and Israel's sense that it was facing existential destruction because of Iran. It's something Netanyahu has repeated for years. What I think is important to emphasize is that I'm not claiming Iran is not a threat, and I'm not claiming that other outside actors are not a threat. I'm saying, the manipulative use of the idea of existential threat is not supported by post-World War II historic precedent, and it matters. Israel shouldn't see itself as possibly facing total destruction as a state, and it would make more pragmatic policies. So that's a point I do want to clarify. I think it doesn't help anybody to dismiss the genuine military threats that are out there, but to see them for what they are and make policy that is more realistic and involves threat management, frankly, rather than going nuclear, so to speak, with this existential threat that must be acted upon with an existential level of military force, which apparently hasn't done that well. That's with the external version. And in terms of internal threats, yes, I do think that what we've seen historically, again, particularly in the post-World War II era, is that states have profoundly changed who they are, usually from within. And some states have collapsed, but that all started from internal discord. So we saw the Soviet Union collapse, we saw Yugoslavia collapse. That was because of internal conflict. And states can change in various ways. The 3 that I point out are changes to their territory, changes to their regime. And sometimes these are so fundamental that they even lead to changes of name or identity. I tried to say maybe we should get away from this language altogether, even domestically. I don't think there's any good to be done by stoking the existential threat fears among the opposition either. But the state can fundamentally change who it is. It, in this case, won't lose territory, but it is expanding its territory as we speak. Annexation in the West Bank is, frankly, almost a done deal. And the government wants to expand to Gaza and possibly even parts of southern Lebanon. And who knows, in the greater Israel Messianic version, maybe even other countries. So the state will fundamentally change its borders, which maybe some people think it's a good thing, but that will also, by definition, fundamentally transform its regime, which again is already underway. The transformation away from liberal democracy is already 3 years past. If you read the VDem Democracy Index, Israel lost that status, and it will continue to completely corrode if Israel formally extends its regime over millions and millions of non-citizens, which, again, it's already done that in the West Bank de facto. So that will change its regime entirely. And that becomes a change of identity, whether the state changes its name formally or not. I think Israelis will not be living under the state that they, those who have a romanticized view think that state once existed in history, some sort of model liberal democracy. Israel never was a model liberal democracy, but in the eyes of the citizens we're talking about who are worried about these things, many of them have a romantic view that Israel once was that way. And I would say more that Israel had potential to go in that direction that it will never fulfill. And at the same time, I also think that if we can, turn the sort of social psychological clock back to 2023, which may be impossible, but pre-October 7th, there was a groundswell of Israelis realizing just how much democracy was missing in Israeli society and how badly it needed to be, reconstituted entirely. This time with a ground floor, with a foundation, I should say, of a constitution and all of that entails. It's not the piece of paper, it's what's in it, obviously. And so that was a very strong and fascinating movement to watch in 2023 for most of the year until October 7th. And I hope that Israelis who were so passionate about that again might really ask themselves those deeper questions and come to the conclusion that I would have liked to see as a starting point, that democracy and occupation are totally and fundamentally commensurate.
So does the cliche that this upcoming election will be the most fateful one of our lifetime ring true to you?
Every election that I've worked on, the campaigns, and I've worked on 9 elections starting in 1999. That's not every single one. Believe me, we've had even more than that. But it has been, 27 years of watching election campaigns and being part of them. And every time we said this is the most important election in Israel's history, it's going to change the course of the country. And every time it was true. I think that this time the difference is that Israel has gone so far in the direction of an undemocratic transformation and becoming really an expansionist, permanent expansionist, occupying undemocratic state, that it will be much harder to turn the clock back. Certainly if, if a far-right government wins, they won't want to turn it back.
Well, Dahlia, we'll be watching, waiting, really depending on your columns and commentary. I really highly recommend the last few about the existential threat because they're very thought-provoking. Thank you, as usual, for joining the podcast, and I am sure we'll be speaking again soon.
I hope so, and I look forward to it. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Dr. Dahlia Scheindlin, and to my producer and editor, Adi Shacham. If you want to continue to listen to our podcast and make sure you don't miss an episode, please subscribe to us on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're inclined to do so, leave us a comment and a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all of the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Alison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.